For the Washington Examiner, I'm Siraj Hashmi, and this is Hashing It Out. The Department of Justice Inspector General Michael Horowitz released his IG report about FISA abuse and the process in which they surveilled the Trump campaign during the 2016 presidential election. My guest today is criminal justice reporter for the Washington Examiner, Jerry Dunleavy. Jerry, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Siraj.
So, first of all, there was a big controversy about the Inspector General report and about everything that kind of was involved in the FISA process. Why was there a big controversy about it to begin with?
So this all kind of begins in 2016. So the FBI was running an investigation into former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and her use of a private email server where she was sending and receiving some classified information. So the FBI was investigating that. At the same time, the FBI, once that investigation had wrapped up, the FBI opened a counterintelligence investigation into members of President Trump's campaign. And as part of that counterintelligence investigation, the FBI decided to use a dossier put together by a British former MI6 agent named Christopher Steele. Now, there's a problem there. There's a lot of problems with that. Steele had been hired by Fusion GPS, which at that time was working as an opposition research firm for the Clinton campaign and the DNC. The FBI used information from Steele's dossier that they did not corroborate themselves, salacious claims, unverified claims about Trump associates, and Russia, and they used that information in FISA applications with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to obtain surveillance warrants and then renewals starting in October of 2016 all the way through the summer of 2017 against a former Trump campaign associate, Carter Page. That's kind of where all of this starts. There's a lot of problems and issues, as you can see there, and then the IG report revealed a lot more.
So, getting a little bit into the IG report, what are some of the things that people are missing about what Michael Horowitz actually compiled? Because it's over 400 pages of damning evidence and information about the FBI, the practices that they went through in order to sort of start these surveillance and counterintelligence operations against the Trump campaign in 2016 in particular. What are people missing about it?
We've kind of all heard the big highlights, that there were 17 significant missteps and omissions related to the FISA process, exculpatory information that was withheld from the FISA court that should have been presented to the court. It's important to keep in mind that this is a secret court, and in this court, it's just the government that's showing up. There's no defense lawyer or anyone defending the rights of the person being accused, and so the government has an extra responsibility to make sure that in an ex parte proceeding, they are presenting all of the relevant information, both incriminating and exculpatory information, so that the judges on the court can make the correct decision. And a lot of that information was withheld from the court. A few things that people have been missing. James Comey and Deputy FBI Director Andrew McCabe didn't just want to use the dossier in FISA applications and warrants against Carter Page. They also wanted to use this unverified dossier in the intelligence community assessment about Russian interference that was released in January 2017. People might remember that intelligence community assessment assessed that Russia had interfered in the 2016 election and that the Russians had shown a preference for Trump and a desire to hurt Hillary Clinton. Comey wanted the Steele dossier and information from the Steele dossier put into that intelligence community assessment. Now, the CIA ended up shooting that down, calling the dossier basically internet rumors. But it's pretty stunning that Comey wanted the Steele dossier not just to be used in a secret proceeding against one person, but actually wanted information from it put into a really important and high-profile assessment. And if that had ended up happening and had come out, it probably would have been pretty damaging. It probably would have done a lot of harm, I think, to the credibility of that assessment.
Let's talk a little bit about James Comey, because he went on Fox News Sunday. In reaction, I think it's his first interview since the IG report came out, had somewhat of an about-face moment.
You think this is vindication?
It is. I mean, the FBI's had to wait 2 years while the president and his followers lied about the institution. Finally, the truth gets told.
Does your report vindicate Mr. Comey?
It doesn't vindicate anyone at the FBI who touched this, including the leadership.
The IG says you should feel no vindication.
Well, maybe it turns upon how we understand the word. What I mean is that the FBI was accused of treason, of illegal spying, of tapping Mr. Trump's wires illegally, of opening an investigation without justification, of being a criminal conspiracy to defeat and then unseat a president. All of that was nonsense. I think it's really important that the Inspector General looked at that and that the American people, your viewers and all viewers, understand that's true. But he also found things that we were never accused of, which is real sloppiness, and that's concerning. As I've said all along, has to be focused on. If I were director, I'd be very concerned about it and diving into it.
Well, sloppiness may be a euphemism for what it is he found. One of his big concerns is the way the FBI handled the FISA applications and the warrants that allowed you to surveil Carter Page, who was a former foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign. Again, here is what you said about the FISA process and what the Inspector General Horowitz said this week. Take a look.
I have total confidence that the FISA process was followed and that the entire case was handled in a thoughtful, responsible way by DOJ and the FBI.
We identified significant inaccuracies and omissions in each of the 4 applications, 7 in the first application and a total of 17 by the final renewal application.
17 significant errors in the FISA process, and you say that it was handled in a thoughtful and appropriate way.
Yeah, he's right. I was wrong. I was overconfident in the procedures that the FBI and Justice had built over 20 years. I thought they were robust enough. It's incredibly hard to get a FISA. I was overconfident in those because he's right. There was real sloppiness. 17 things that either should have been in the applications or at least discussed and characterized differently. It was not acceptable. And so he's right. I was wrong.
A lot of competing narratives here. Comey says that he was vindicated when the IG report came out, and Horowitz testifies that no one at the FBI should feel vindicated. And then in the very next follow-up, you see that Comey says that he was wrong and that the Inspector General is right. What are your immediate thoughts when you hear this?
So another interesting thing that Comey says in that clip is he basically paints it as all that he was being accused of was being part of a deep state plot to unseat a president. And because Horowitz didn't find that, therefore he's vindicated. But that's not the only issue that people had here. Something doesn't have to be a deep state coup to be wrong. That's a very, very, I mean, that's an incredible standard that he's setting for himself. And the problems that people had was using information that from Christopher Steele that was unverified, using information from someone that was working for the opposing presidential campaign, who, by his own admission, was desperate for the president to lose, using that information and making it as Horowitz found, a central and essential part of the decision to move forward with FISA surveillance on Carter Page. I mean, these are big problems, and Comey kind of wants to just hand wave it away because some of the more inflammatory things that Trump said, that Trump tweeted out, Horowitz didn't find, and so therefore everything's okay. And that's not really the way it works, because there were serious allegations being made by very serious people about the problems at the FBI and the problems with what they were doing and the way that they were cutting corners and the way that they were going after people. And Horowitz found that a lot of those accusations were right. The FBI was making big mistakes, was cutting big corners, and was withholding big information that it shouldn't have been.
So in the context of the IG report, we could pretty much get a sense of who was the big loser here, that being the FBI and James Comey and pretty much everyone involved in the FISA process. But who wins? Who really takes a victory lap after this?
Well, you know, it's hard to find any winners in something like this. I mean, this is the problem with when you have big, high-profile investigations like the Clinton investigation and then the investigation into Trump. The problem is that when you run investigations like that and you don't run them very well, there's not going to be any winners here because, for instance, the Christopher Steele's dossier and the allegations in it kind of set a narrative when the dossier was released in 2017, kind of set a narrative of this sort of idea of a grand conspiracy between Trump and the Russians. And it's a narrative that was believed by a large segment of the population. It's a narrative that was pushed by a lot of people in the media, a lot of people in politics, a lot of lawmakers. And it's a narrative that, after a 2-year investigation by Special Counsel Mueller, didn't end up being true. Mueller found that the Russians interfered in 2016, but didn't find that there was any sort of criminal conspiracy between any members of the Trump campaign and any Russians. But this is the problem with what the FBI did, is that they were running with a narrative that they weren't fact-checking. In fact, the more that they looked into the allegations in Christopher Steele's dossier, the more they found that there was reason to doubt it, that Steele was embellishing, that his sources may have been embellishing, that there were real problems and flaws here. By January of 2017, the FBI basically knew that some of the biggest, most damning claims in the Steele dossier probably weren't true, but they never told the FISA court, and they continued to surveil Carter Page and continued on with their investigation as if they weren't learning new information. It's really troubling, it's really problematic, and there's going to have to be more of a reckoning than just sort of an oops from Comey on Fox News.
So how is the FISA process supposed to work?
The FISA process is first off, it's very complicated. It's also a bit opaque. We know more about this specific FISA process, the way that the FBI used the FISA court to go after Trump campaign associate Carter Page. We know more about this FISA process than we know about any other because these are secret processes done through a secret court. Now, how it's supposed to work is that the allegations that you make in the FISA process, when you're applying for electronic surveillance against someone, those allegations are supposed to be fact-checked and verified. It's a little bit nerdy, but it's in what's called a Woods file. That's the name of kind of the master sheet that you have, making sure that you're checking and verifying all of these big claims that you're making. And they were making big claims about Carter Page. They were claiming that he was an agent of the Russians, that he was working with Paul Manafort to help the Russians interfere in 2016, and on and on and on. So there were some big claims here. And what the FBI is supposed to do is be able to go and show and prove that they verified all of these various allegations and claims. That's not what they did in this process.
So how did they abuse the process?
Well, how they abused it was they took allegations that Christopher Steele was making in a dossier while he was working essentially for on behalf of the Clinton campaign and the DNC. They took allegations that he was making based on sources that they hadn't been talking to, and they put those allegations into applications, submitting them to the court and verifying to the court, yeah, this is true, we think this is true because basically we trust Christopher Steele. And that's not doing your due diligence at all, because that's not how this process is supposed to work. And as they started to get around to investigating some of the claims and started to get around to talking to some of Christopher Steele's sources, a lot of doubts started getting cast on the credibility of this, especially the big claims that he was making about this grand conspiracy existing between the Trump campaign and the Russians. But the doubts that were cast on the Steele dossier and on Christopher Steele himself and on the information they were giving the court, those doubts never made their way to the court. The FBI never told the court, hey, by the way, the stuff that we were saying before, it's looking like it's probably not true. That information never got to the court, this exculpatory information. And that's really troubling and really problematic.
What other troubling aspects are to this? Because there's so much more going on than just that.
Right. So there were other ways that the FBI carried out the investigation that are really problematic. One interesting tidbit in the IG report is about an October 2016 meeting that the FBI had with Christopher Steele. Now, they ended up cutting Christopher Steele off as a source right at the start of November, when he was found to have been leaking to the media right before the election. But in October 2016, they hold a big meeting with Steele, and they are trying to get as much information from Steele as possible. And as part of that, they tell Christopher Steele some pretty incredible details about what they know and what they're looking into. They tell Steele that they are investigating Carter Page, that they're investigating Mike Flynn, that they're investigating Paul Manafort, that they're investigating George Papadopoulos, and they tell him how Crossfire Hurricane, this Trump-Russia investigation, got started, with them receiving information from an Australian diplomat who heard information from a Trump campaign associate about the Russians possibly having some sort of damaging information on Hillary Clinton. So they told Christopher Steele all of this. Now, the reason why that's problematic, or the biggest reason why, is that Christopher Steele was working for Fusion GPS, which was working for the Clinton campaign. And Christopher Steele turned around after that meeting and told Fusion GPS what the FBI had told him. And so Fusion GPS, working for the opposing presidential campaign, now had inside information about what the FBI was doing and how the FBI was investigating people associated with the rival campaign. Really problematic. Another really interesting thing that the FBI decided to do was, during the election, the intelligence community gave intelligence briefings to the Clinton campaign and to the Trump campaign about sort of just general briefings about things that they should know, sort of intelligence threats out there. For the meeting that the intelligence community did for the Trump campaign, they sent the supervisory special agent at the FBI who was running the investigation into Mike Flynn. They sent him to give the briefing to Trump and Mike Flynn, and used that as a pretext, as Horowitz said, as a pretext to sort of see how Flynn reacted to the information that they were telling him, and then took the information that they gathered during that meeting from Trump and from Flynn, turned around and made that information part of their continued investigation into Mike Flynn. And so they basically used what is a very important thing that the intelligence community does, is tells presidential candidates about intelligence threats out there. And they use that as part of their investigation into Mike Flynn. And so it's a really troubling thing. Horowitz had some real problems with that.
One thing that some folks out there are reacting to with respect to the FISA process is that the FISA judges were lied to. What is the likelihood, though, that maybe the FISA judges weren't exactly lied to, but possibly complicit in sort of giving a rubber stamp to these applications for surveillance?
It's a good question, and it's a question that's still kind of up in the air right now. The FISA court does have an incredibly high rate of approval. Something like 97, 98, 99% of applications get approved by the FISA court. we don't have a very good insight right now into whether the process that was used against Carter Page, if this is part of a pattern or if this was sort of a one-off thing, because they were, I guess, so interested or perhaps so desperate to carry out this investigation that they cut a bunch of corners. There is responsibility that the FISA court should have for asking really tough questions, and it doesn't look like they were asking those tough questions. It looks like they were expecting the FBI to do its due diligence and to present them with the full truth, which was not being presented to them. And so, the FBI was definitely being misleading, but it does look like the FISA court itself kind of fell down on the job too.
A week after IG Horowitz released his report about the abuse of the FISA courts by the FBI, Rosemary Collier, the presiding judge of the FISA court, released an order rebuking the FBI, criticizing them for misleading the court on its FISA applications to spy on Trump campaign advisor Carter Page. In the letter, Collier wrote, quote, "The FBI's handling of the Carter Page applications as portrayed in the Office of Inspector General report was antithetical to the heightened duty of candor described above. The frequency with which representations by FBI personnel turned out to be unsupported or contradicted by information in their possession, and with which they withheld information detrimental to their case, calls into question whether information contained in other FBI applications is reliable. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court expects the government to provide complete and accurate information in every filing with the court. Without it, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court cannot properly ensure that the government conducts electronic surveillance for foreign intelligence purposes only when there is sufficient factual basis." End quote. Democrats and Republicans, as soon as the IG report came out, had a lot of competing narratives. Both sort of spun it their way to make it look like they were right. Back in 2018, there was the Schiff and the Nunes memos from the House Intelligence Committee. A lot of the things that we're seeing now, the Nunes memo ended up getting right, but Democrats seem to think that everything that happened with the FBI investigating the Trump campaign, that they were somehow, as James Comey put it, vindicated. They were justified. Who's getting it right, and who's getting it wrong? I mean, what is it that I've asked this before? What are people missing? But with respect to the Democrats and Republicans and their narratives, who's getting it right now?
It's a great question. So Horowitz's investigation came to conclusions on two sort of big aspects of the Trump-Russia investigation. He came to a conclusion about whether that investigation sort of had a justifiable launch, whether it was okay for the FBI to open that investigation to begin with. And then he looked into, okay, this investigation is open in July, at the end of July 2016. Was the FBI justified in the way that it conducted that investigation for the ensuing months or almost year before it was handed over to Special Counsel Mueller? And he came to sort of differing conclusions there that people have kind of tried to take into their own narrative. So Democrats have sort of done a victory lap about the fact that he didn't find any bias. He did not uncover or could not point to any specific bias going into the launch of the investigation itself. So the start of the investigation at the end of July 2016. However, Horowitz found huge problems with the way that the FBI conducted its investigation, especially with the way that it conducted the FISA process and its surveillance of Carter Page and the omissions that it had, and the way that it seemingly misled the court. So while he wasn't able to uncover bias related to the opening of the investigation, he's very, very, very careful about his conclusion on bias going into the actual conduct of the investigation. When Horowitz testified in front of the Senate, he basically said, all of these missteps, all of these problems with what the FBI was doing, it's either basically gross negligence or intentional misconduct, and he's not sure which. And he said that he did not get satisfactory answers from the FBI and from the DOJ about why they were making these troubling decisions throughout the investigation. So, Democrats can point to the investigation's launch being justified, according to Horowitz, but Republicans have a lot to point to when it comes to the actual conduct of the investigation that Horowitz found pretty troubling.
What role has Attorney General Barr played in all of this? Because he, immediately after the release of the report, there was an objection on his part. First of all, what did he object to, and how is he kind of seeing this through?
So, Attorney General Barr, his problem with Horowitz's conclusion was Horowitz's conclusion about the actual launch of the investigation itself in July 2016. So the investigation gets officially opened and launched in July 2016. The FBI gets its first FISA warrant against Carter Page in October 2016. And Barr says that, just hold on a moment, when it comes to coming to a decision about whether the FBI was justified in launching that investigation to begin with, because Barr, in May of this year, was given full declassification authority by President Trump to look into the origins of the Trump-Russia investigation, how it got started. Now, Horowitz did a very thorough job, but he's also very limited in what he's able to look at. For instance, as an Inspector General, he's able to look at what's going on inside the Department of Justice. He's able to look at what's going on inside the FBI, but he can't compel people to testify. He can't set up a grand jury. And even some of the people that he was able to talk to, like James Comey or former FBI top lawyer Jim Baker, when he wanted to reinstate their security clearances so that he could talk to them about classified information, refresh their memories about things, talk to them about other things that he had uncovered to see why they were doing what they were doing, both of those individuals said, no, that's all right. We don't want our security clearances back. And so what that means is that even in that instance, Horowitz wasn't able to talk to James Comey about any new classified information. He wasn't able to talk to Jim Baker about any new classified information. And so there are potential questions sort of left unanswered about what they did and why they did it. He was also limited in some of the people that he could talk to. He wanted to talk to Jonathan Weiner, a former State Department official who had interactions with Fusion GPS, who had interactions with Christopher Steele. And I believe Jonathan Weiner just said, no, that's all right, and that's the end of it.
So you can't compel them to...
Can't compel them. Horowitz wanted to talk to the founders of Fusion GPS, Glenn Simpson. Glenn Simpson said no, and that's that. So Horowitz was limited in what he was able to look into, and beyond that, William Barr has selected U.S. Attorney John Durham to run his own investigation.
So let's get into U.S. Attorney John Durham, because he has been selected by Attorney General Barr to sort of have a bigger purview of all of this. They call it the investigating the investigators. First of all, how is his investigation different from IG Horowitz? And what does his investigation entail?
So Barr was given full declassification authority by President Trump earlier in the year. And the Attorney General decided to pick U.S. Attorney John Durham to be sort of his right-hand man. And what they are looking into is sort of the origins of this investigation, how it got started. They're also looking into, as Barr has recently revealed, the conduct of the investigation as well. Durham is able to do some things that Horowitz just wasn't able to. As a U.S. attorney who's been sort of deputized by Attorney General Barr to look into all these issues, he's able to look at what happened inside the Department of Justice, and he's able to compel testimony there. He's able to set up grand juries. He's able to, if he wants to, carry out criminal investigations. And he's also able to look at things outside the Department of Justice. He's been talking to the other U.S. intelligence agencies, apparently been talking to the CIA, possibly the NSA, asking them sort of if they were involved and what their role was in looking into members of the Trump campaign and any ties they allegedly had to Russia. Barr and Durham are also talking to foreign governments about what role they may have played or any help they may have given in the investigation into Trump campaign associates and the Russians. So they've done a few overseas trips. They've talked to the government of, I believe, the UK, Italy, Australia, and so they sort of have a broader scope. And Barr has just, his quibble with Horowitz is that Barr is kind of leaving open the door that there might be more information out there about why the FBI was doing what it was doing that Horowitz just couldn't find. And so he's kind of cautioning patience to let Durham do his job, to let that investigation run its course and see what Durham might come up with.
And a lot of people are expecting that investigation to wrap up in, what, mid-2020?
Right. So I think some people were hoping that Barr and Durham might be able to issue some sort of competing report to what's going on with impeachment right now or something like that. But it's really not looking like that's going to happen. Barr, in a recent interview, said that Durham is taking his time, is looking at a lot of different stuff, and that we might get some sort of report or some sort of finding in spring or summer of 2020, basically right in the middle of the next election.
What happens now? I mean, what can we expect from the FISA court? Will there be reform? Will anybody be held accountable for this?
Yeah, well, we'll see. Out of all of this and out of this entire investigation, it looks like there may have been one criminal referral that we know of, one criminal investigation. An FBI lawyer had altered a document about Carter Page. Carter Page had been essentially a source of information actually for the CIA related to Russia a number of years back. And the FBI had been told that information but didn't tell the court about it. And when they were reminded of it by the CIA, this FBI lawyer, believed to be Kevin Kleinsmith, altered that document, altered the email from the CIA and changed it from Carter Page being a source to being not a source, and then passed that along. So it looks like there might be one criminal referral, maybe one person that might end up getting charged with something, but it's not looking like a lot of criminal indictments are going to be handed down here. Will the FISA court reform? This is kind of up in the air and in the hands of lawmakers. Some Democrats have had a lot of problems with the FISA court in the past about sort of their belief that this electronic surveillance that it allows goes too far. Republicans, because of sort of the abuses that were uncovered during the investigation, during Horowitz's investigation, and these abuses related to how the FBI investigated members of the Trump campaign, now Republicans seem to be on board with the idea that the FISA process is flawed and needs to be reformed. But we'll see if they're able to come to sort of any sort of agreement, because their problems with the FISA court definitely seem to be coming from two different angles, especially since Democrats are largely defending still what the FBI did and what the FISA court did in 2016 and 2017.
Jerry, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And that's our show for today. Subscribe to the podcast on whichever podcast app you're using, whether it be Apple, Spotify, Ricochet, Stitcher, what have you. Go to our website, WashingtonExaminer.com, and follow us on Twitter @DCExaminer. You can also follow me on there. I'm at Siraj Hashmi. And by all means, tell your friends and family about the show. As always, special thanks to everyone who was involved in the creation of this podcast, to the Washington Examiner team, my family and friends, and to you, the listener, for being a part of the journey. For the Washington Examiner, I'm Siraj Hashmi, and this is Hashing It Out.